My tractor is getting excessive pressure in the crankcase, and it's burning a lot of oil in the right side cylinder, which fouls the plug. It idles poorly. Today I'm out in the shop replacing the head gaskets on my Cub Cadet SLT 1554 lawn tractor, but this applies to any tractor with the Kohler V-Twin engine, which a number of OEMs use. Specifically, my engine is a Kohler CV740, but again, this applies to all Kohler V-Twin engines. On my channel, I do general automotive work, modifications, and tips. If you find this video helpful, consider subscribing and watching the other videos. Remember to always take your negative off first and then the positive. You're going to want to take the positive battery terminal off, and this is just 7/16 wrench. 7/16 head size bolt on each end. Remove the air filter cover and air filter. I'm removing the fan guard by removing the 4 7mm head size bolts. Two 8mm head size screws on the rectifier, and then just one electrical connector that pulls off. You could just leave the rectifier regulator attached to the blower cover. The mounting bolts don't secure the blower cover to the engine. They just secure the rectifier to the blower housing, but I choose to remove it. Two 10mm head size bolts on the fuel pump. You don't have to take the fuel pump all the way off, and fuel line pops out right there. The breather separator just has one line here, pulls off, and then a grommet that goes into the valve cover. It's easiest just to take off the dipstick tube here, because you have to get to one bolt head back here instead of fighting for that bolt head. Just take the dipstick loose here. It's a 10mm head size bolt. That just gives you a little more room for this 8mm head size bolt for the blower housing. Then just 4 8mm head size bolts on each side, so 8 total. So 4 here, 2 more. That's a ground strap for the rectifier. Two 10mm head size nuts on the air cleaner housing, and then 2 more 8mm head size bolts down the bottom. Next, I'm going to take the muffler loose in the front and then off for the header pipes in the back so that I can get at these bracket bolts better on this side. 13mm head size bolts. I'm going to take that loose but not all the way off. Each exhaust pipe, there's two 13mm head size nuts. One here on the outside and then one on the inside for both sides. So here's a good reason to take your positive battery terminal off. This is a starter solenoid. It's hot on this side. Then it's just the same thing on the other side. Two 13mm nuts. So now that I have the exhaust pipes off, I can get to the two 10mm head size bolts that are under here on each side holding the bracket for the throttle. And 4 8mm head size bolts on the intake manifold. Prior to removing the 4 bolts on the intake manifold, I'm removing the 2 wires from each of the ignition modules. The governor, we need to remove the one linkage here, and that's simply one spring and a little latch that just pushes over, unclips like that, and you can pull out the linkage. And then we got to worry about the little spring here beside it. Just a little needle nose. Down and out. And this other bracket could get out of the way here. Flip that wire tie off of there. Give us a little more breathing room here. Carburetor assembly. Back here. And we can disconnect the sensor. I'm gonna pause for a minute and use some parts cleaner and clean up this dirty engine before I open it up. I don't want to open up the internals of an engine and have it be this dirty on the outside. For the two inside shields, it's just one 10mm bolt on each. For each of the side shields, there's a 10mm bolt underneath and an 8mm bolt tucked back in here. I'm going to take the other bolt out of the starter to get this shield off. Four 8mm head size bolts. Four 13mm head size head bolts. Let's see if we can tell where the spot is. Right here. Notice the tracking right there. Right here. Between the oil passage here and the cylinder. Let's see anything completely broken, but that looks like it right there. That little area tracking between this oil passage. Look how much oil is in the cylinder. And you can see here how it's blown out right there on the head, and debris in the hole here. That's the top side, so there's no passage there, but oil coming through here. Clean that up with a Scotch-Brite pad too. Here's the top of the cylinder and head gasket area and top of piston all cleaned up with a green pad, lacquer thinner, and a little bit of carburetor cleaner. So it's ready for the new head gasket. Let's take a look at the new head gasket. It's supposed to be improved over the old one. Here's the old one. It does look beefier here. Let's lay it on top. Let's have the reinforcing ring on it here, which is nice. We have the new one on top. It's got much more beef around the edges. It's going to stick out past the head, which doesn't hurt anything. I don't know about this area is the fending area right here. So it does have the new reinforcing ring there. So yeah, significantly different head gasket. So then the hardware kit and intake manifold gaskets, exhaust manifold gaskets, and I suppose this is an intake manifold gasket also. Here we are back at the tractor. You want to make sure you have no oil on the new gasket. So this oil is puddling in here. You want to make sure you clean that out, and again, clean the flange with a good lacquer thinner. And make sure you clean your head up. And you should go ahead and pull your spark plugs when your heads are on, because you're going to clean them anyway. This is the good side, so it should be clean, but the dirty side follows the plug. So you want to clean it or replace it anyway. Yep, that plug is in pretty good shape. And that's the offending side. You can tell how dirty that is. If you get the autofocus to work. It's pretty dirty. It's all carboned up and balled out. So according to the Kohler manual, we're going to torque these head bolts in kind of a star pattern. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to torque them in 2 stages, 17 foot-pounds or 200 inch-pounds, 22.6 Newton meters for the first stage, and then 31 foot-pounds or 370 inch-pounds and 41.8 Newton meters in the second stage or final stage. So again, we're going to make sure that our head gasket is clean and free from oil. So I'm going to clean it one more time with lacquer thinner. And following up, cleaning this out. I could elevate the front of my tractor to get the oil to pool to the back of the crankcase. That would help somewhat, but we're leaking oil out of this hydraulic lifter. And again, I want to make sure I have a clean part of my rag and wipe this down. This head gasket is supposed to be completely dry and oil free when I install it, and it's supposed to have the printing up on it. This one doesn't have any printing on it, so the wide part of the flange is towards the cylinder, like so. And then my head that's been cleaned up with a Scotch-Brite pad and again lacquer thinner, clean up the whole flange area. And now I can either loosen these are hydraulic lifters. I could either loosen these to get room here, or I can just leave them torqued down and know that I have to overcome this spring pressure when I torque these down. And make sure I'm putting my push rods back in. So again, I can either take these out or play with them to get them back in properly, but they have to be seated here in the rocker arm and in the lifter. And again, I'm just going to snug these down. I'm going to torque them, so I'm not going to put any force on them. I'm just going to draw them in and make sure I got all my bolts threaded in good first. Make sure I got my push rods seated both in the rocker arm and down in the lifter. So I'm going to double check to make sure I'm seated down in the lifter, and I am. A safe bet, if you haven't done this before, is just go ahead and take these out, and there's torque down. And the rocker arms are torqued down, whether you have black screws to 18.1 Newton meters or 160 inch-pounds, or if you have the silver screws to 13 Newton meters and 120 inch-pounds. So 1, 2, 3, just in a star pattern, 4, and then to 30 foot-pounds, same star pattern. Double check. Huh. There it goes. One more time. Go. There's two kinds of valve cover gaskets. Again, I'm cleaning this up with lacquer thinner. There's the orange O-ring style like I have, and then there's an RTV sealant gasket. So RTV gasket, those bolts get torqued to 3.4 Newton meters or 30 inch-pounds. Then if you have the black O-ring with shoulder screws or without shoulder screws, the 5.6, 50 inch-pounds, 88 inch-pounds, or the yellow and brown O-ring with their internal spacers like I have, 55 inch-pounds. And then also they get torqued in a sequence, 1, 2, star pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the end of this side. I got to do the other side, but I'm not going to show you the other side. I'll show you assembling the rest of it when I get the other side done. As I'm cleaning up the left side cylinder and piston top, I don't think I adequately explained that if you don't take the rocker arms off of the heads, that you really should put the piston at top dead center, and just before top dead center both valves are closed, which means that the rocker arms are loose and you can get a better torque on the head because you don't have the pressure that you're pushing against the spring through the push rod to torque the head down. And if you put the piston at top dead center, you're also able to clean the top of the piston easier, and you're not cleaning the cylinder wall and taking all the oil off the cylinder wall when you have the piston at top dead center. I don't know if I need any further explanation than that. It's a 4-stroke engine, and it has 2 valves, an exhaust valve and an intake valve. And when the intake valve is open on the intake stroke and the piston is down, or the piston travels down, the intake valve is open, it's sucking in air. And then as the piston comes back up, the intake valve closes, and that's a compression stroke. It compresses the air-fuel mixture, then you get a spark, and as the piston is traveling down, you're using that energy to put into the crankshaft to drive whatever you want to drive with the engine. And then on the stroke coming up, the intake valve opens and you're exhausting that spent air-fuel mixture. So you want both valves closed, and that occurs at one point at top dead center. So you can tell when you wiggle the rocker arms that there isn't a lot of pressure on them, and you can see that the valves are all the way up. The springs are not compressed. Here we are back at the tractor after getting both heads disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled with the new head gaskets. We're going to continue the process with putting the side shields back on. Those help with the airflow from the fan to air cool the cylinders through the fins. On the left side, it's a 10mm head size underneath and 8mm on the top. You can tell I didn't take this one completely off. This one has a little grommet and a little holder for the fuel line, so I didn't take it completely off. And then the right side shield, remember we didn't take all the way off. It has this smart ignition on it, and it has the 8mm and 10mm underneath. Get the 8mm just started because the bottom one is hard to do, and here's a good reference up here in the top for the bottom one. And then the front and center, remember there's one 10mm head size bolt for each of these. It's dedicated to this, and then the other bolts get picked up by other things on the bottom. This just goes in place until those other pieces get put on. Before we bring the intake back down, remember the 2 springs. This one didn't go anywhere. It was in there already. And this one was positioned like that. So hole right beneath it, I believe, and then like that. I'm just gonna hit those intakes with a little just there. Make sure no debris got down in them. Before we bring the intake manifold back down into place, replace the little gaskets. And remember, if it's plastic, it's got the little O-ring type gaskets, and if it's got a metal intake manifold, it also comes with a paper with an adhesive coating on them. I'm just using a little jeweler's screwdriver to get this one out. Flat part goes down. And they fit in there pretty good. You could use a little RTV to help hold them in place, but if you don't really need to, I don't need to. Or you could use a little silicone grease or something on them to hold them in place. And I'm going to be careful with my linkages and bring them down where they need to be. And all my wires, you know, make sure I have my wire for my carburetor here. Bring it down to where it needs to be, and then the sensor right here, it's an oil pressure sensor, I believe. That back in place. And just take my time and being careful not to upset my two gaskets. Double check them, set them down, line up first bolt. Let's see if I can get it started here. Line up a bolt and get it started. And remember, those are 8mm head size bolts. And these should be torqued in a sequence, first in 2 increments, first to 7.4 Newton meters or 66 inch-pounds, and then to 9.9 Newton meters or 88 inch-pounds. So I'm going to snug them all up first and then go back and tighten them up. So this is the torque sequence that the Kohler manual is recommending. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Have the intake in place. I can double check everything else, get my wires straightened out. Remember, I cut the wire tie that was right here. Straighten that out. And I forgot a ground right here on the intake, so I need to put that back. That goes back here on this intake manifold bolt. And now I'm going to be torqued out of sequence unless I go back and loosen them and retorque them. But I don't think it's that critical as long as I don't over torque them. And before I put that back on, I'm going to clean that up with a wire brush. Make sure I get a good ground. Grab a new wire tie, put it back on. And I didn't need to put this governor linkage on as I'm putting the intake on, or the throttle linkage here. I can do it now. Remember, I put that clip back on the way it was supposed to be. Unclip that. Take it off. Get it back in there. I'm going to let it drop because I'm going to put this spring back in first. So my linkage is in. It's probably going to be harder to put the spring in. So I'm going to take the spring without abusing it too much. Put it in. Hold that clip with my finger. Slide it in there. Take the clip and rotate it up and around. Clip it back in. That's it. That's the governor linkage back on. For this, I'm going to bring you in closer, and we're going to install the throttle and the choke linkage here. This piece goes on top and then just gets bolted up underneath each of the cylinder heads. I'm going to leave that off for just a minute. I'm going to set that linkage here. Now these two springs go on the back here to be able to show you that, but to install this, first this choke linkage goes on the choke right here, and that's the first thing you have to do. But I'm going to show you where the springs go first before I install that, because you won't be able to see where the springs go. So this little spring goes on second. It goes right here. That's for the governor linkage right here, and this is part of the throttle here. So the throttle is back here, allows the governor to work with that spring, and it's got a little set screw right here that you can change the idle on it right there, and how the governor, this lever has a little hole in it here, that's where this spring goes. So this linkage in first, like that, like so, and then the little guy in tight here, and then the bigger one back here. Down here, there, and now you can bring this one back. It's the anchor point for the air filter housing, and then this gets bolted up onto the cylinders underneath with our 4 10mm head size bolts. This fuel line, this fuel hose, should have been tucked back behind here underneath the carburetor before I put this bracket on. A little raggedy. Could probably clean that up a little bit with some electrical tape, like that. Before I go any further, I'm gonna gap, clean, and reinstall my spark plugs. Or now is a good time to put new spark plugs in. They're gapped at 30 thousandths or 0.67 millimeters, and they're torqued to 20 foot-pounds or 27 Newton meters if you're interested. Now is a good time to grease up that pivot point in the front. You can get to the back of that, but it's a channel, so there's a front and a back to it. It's hard to get to it in the front, it's easy to get to in the back. The two 10mm head size starter bolts are torqued to 135 inch-pounds or 15.3 Newton meters. I've got the engine back together far enough I can do an initial startup and see how it runs. Now I used a good high temp header paint on those exhaust pipes, but I didn't allow them to cure at all, and I didn't put them in the oven, heat them up slow, so they bubble pretty good on me and then turned off. Good thing. Since I have the tractor in the shop, I'm also going to replace the fuel filter and add a fuel shutoff valve. If you'd like more information on that, I'll put a link to that video in this video's description. These are 8mm and these are 10mm. The blower housing goes on a little harder than if you had just taken the blower housing off and put it back on, say to do the ignition modules or something, because you've disturbed all these little shields and you got to line them all back up to the holes, and there's multiple shields that go to each hole. There are 4 8mm head size bolts on the left side and 4 8mm head size bolts on the right side. There's 2 long and 2 short for each side. The 2 long go towards the front of the tractor. So the problem with these brackets is you're trying to line up 3 different things. You're trying to line up the hole, actually 4 different things in this case because of this bracket for the cables. But there's, see if I can get this to autofocus, where the screwdriver is this shield, this side shield is underneath the blower housing, which is underneath this bracket, and you have to line all 3 of these things up with the hole and then get the bolt in it. It's kind of a pain on this side. And the last one has the ground strap on it. So that's the two 8mm head size rectifier bolts. Got the rectifier already plugged back in. I just gotta finish tightening this one up. Wanted to wait for that one for last. That's the blower housing bolt, so that I could line up this hole up here with the ground strap. And those are 10mm head size bolts. And the fan guard. And again, these bolts are 7mm. This Kohler V-Twin command engine was burning so much oil in that right cylinder that it would hardly idle. So it's idling pretty nice right now. And that lope like a Harley makes me think that maybe Kohler is making the Harley V-Twin engine. Let me know in the comments if that is true. If we were in Tennessee, I'd say it now runs like a scalded dog. Let me idle it up for you, give it some throttle. Now that concludes the video. If you found it helpful, let me know in the comments. And if you did, please subscribe. I look forward to your comments.